The church bells of Whiskey Bend tolled like a death knell across the Arizona territory, their bronze voices carrying over dusty streets where merchants hawked their wares beneath a merciless May sun. Charlotte Crowley stood before the cracked mirror in St. Matthew's vestry, her reflection splintered into fragments that seemed to mock this morning in 1881. Her wedding dress, white silk that had belonged to her deceased mother, felt like a burial shroud. At 19, Charlotte possessed the refined beauty expected of a mayor's daughter. Golden hair and fashionable curls, pale blue eyes that had inherited her father's calculating intelligence and porcelain skin that spoke of a sheltered life. But beneath her corset, pressed against her ribs in an oilskin pouch, lay evidence that could destroy everything her family had built. The leather-bound ledger contained 3 years of records, detailing the systematic theft of Apache land through orchestrated raids, forged documents, and bribed officials' crimes that had made the Crowley family wealthy. Charlotte's fingers trembled as she touched the concealed evidence. She had discovered the book 3 nights ago while searching her father's private study, and what she found had shattered every illusion about their prosperity. Maps showing seized Apache territories, financial records of bribes, and most damning correspondence with someone identified only as E.C., a partner who had orchestrated the military aspects of their conspiracy. 5 minutes, Miss Charlotte. Reverend Morrison called through the heavy oak door. The door opened, and Mayor Silas Crowley entered with the bearing of a man who had never been denied anything. At 52, he remained imposing despite silver threading through his dark hair. His pale blue eyes, so disturbingly similar to Charlotte's own, held the cold calculation that had made him the most powerful political figure in the territory. "You look radiant, my dear," he said, though steel underlay his words. "Thomas is waiting with half the territory's most influential citizens. This union will secure our family's future for generations." Charlotte forced herself to meet his gaze. "What if I don't want to marry him, Father?" The temperature seemed to drop. Silas moved closer, his hand falling on her shoulder with just enough pressure to convey threat. "Want is a luxury we cannot afford. Thomas Blackwood owns 3 of the richest silver mines in the territory. Your marriage will cement partnerships that will benefit this entire region." "Benefit whom exactly?" Silas's grip tightened. "I trust you haven't been asking inconvenient questions around town. Such curiosity can be dangerous in frontier communities." The implied threat confirmed her worst suspicions. Charlotte kept her expression neutral. "I've simply been taking more interest in civic affairs. After today, they'll be Thomas's affairs specifically." Silas adjusted her veil. He understands the importance of discretion regarding sensitive matters. Through the window, Charlotte could see the ridgeline where desert shrubs created patches of green against the sandstone. Somewhere beyond those rocks, if her desperate plan had worked, Dasan waited with horses and the promise of escape. She had met the Chiricahua Apache scout 3 weeks earlier at Morrison's trading post. Their first encounter had been electric with mutual recognition, 2 people trapped by forces beyond their control. Charlotte had been examining fabric when a drunk miner deliberately knocked into Dasan, scattering his beadwork. While others laughed or turned away, Charlotte immediately knelt to help. "You're Mayor Crowley's daughter," Dasan had observed. "And you're Apache, Chiricahua, if the beadwork patterns are authentic. You recognize our designs. I know many things that might surprise people, including the fact that the raids 3 years ago weren't conducted by your people." Dasan's entire body had gone still. "What do you know of those raids?" "I know they were false flags designed to justify land seizures. And I might be able to prove it if someone could help me reach the right authorities." Their whispered conversation had established a simple signal. A white cloth tied to the fence post near the abandoned mine road would mean Charlotte needed immediate extraction. Yesterday, she had slipped out before dawn to tie that cloth. Now, as organ music began to swell, Charlotte made final preparations. The packed church included Sheriff Hal Dodd, whose loyalty to her father was purchased with regular payments. Mine owners and territorial officials filled the pews, all men who had profited from the land seizures. "It's time," Silas announced, offering his arm. Charlotte took it, her pulse racing as they walked toward the sanctuary. Thomas Blackwood waited at the altar, a soft-handed man of 40, whose mining claims made him valuable to her father's empire. The ceremony proceeded with agonizing slowness. Charlotte focused on the stained glass window behind the altar, counting heartbeats like a condemned prisoner. Around her, Whiskey Ben's elite waited to witness the union that would further entrench Crowley dominance. If anyone has cause why this man and woman should not be wed. Reverend Morrison intoned, "Let them speak now or forever hold their peace." The silence stretched for exactly 3 heartbeats. Then Charlotte lifted her white silk skirts and ran. She bolted straight up the center aisle, her dress streaming behind her like a flag of rebellion. Gasps erupted from the congregation as she burst through the doors into blazing sunshine. Her white mare waited exactly where arranged, saddled and ready. Charlotte grabbed the reins and hauled herself up. Behind her, chaos erupted as men poured from the church. "Stop her!" Silas's voice boomed. Charlotte, return here immediately. But she was already galloping toward the ridgeline. Her wedding veil caught the wind and tore free, settling into sagebrush like a discarded ghost. Gunshots cracked behind her. Warning shots meant to frighten rather than kill. A bullet whistled past her ear and shattered Morrison's trading post window. "Alive!" An unfamiliar voice shouted, harsh and rasping. "Take the girl alive. She carries what we need." Charlotte looked back once and saw 7 riders in pursuit, led by a gray-haired man whose military bearing suggested professional competence. But more importantly, she saw a familiar figure on the ridge above Dasan on his paint horse rifle ready. When she reached the slope's base, he rode down to meet her, grabbing her mare's reins without slowing. His dark eyes met hers for one electric instant, and she saw determination and shared understanding of what justice meant. "Ride or die," he said simply. Then they were galloping together across the Arizona wasteland, 2 unlikely allies against the world. As bullets sang around them and the church bells of Whiskey Bend continued their bronze lament, the salt flats stretched before them, their white surface cracked into patterns that reflected the afternoon sun with blinding intensity. Charlotte's wedding dress had become a liability within minutes. The voluminous skirts tangled around her legs, the tight corset restricted her breathing. Dasan pulled up beside her as they reached red stone formations. Without ceremony, he drew a curved blade from his belt. "The dress will kill you before any bullet," he stated. Charlotte nodded and held still as he cut through the corset laces. The sudden release allowed her to draw her first full breath since dawn, gasping as the elaborate bustle collapsed. "Better," she managed, adjusting her position while watching their back trail. "How many following us?" Dasan's eyes swept the horizon with practiced expertise. 7 riders, maybe 8. Moving with purpose, not panic. Professional hunters, not angry townspeople. What's the difference? Angry townspeople give up when pursuit becomes dangerous. Professional hunters follow until the job is finished or they're dead. Dasan studied the distant dust clouds. Someone paid them well. Charlotte carefully extracted the leather-bound book from its oilskin pouch, her hands still trembling. The ledger was perhaps 8 inches by 12, bound in brown leather with brass corners, its pages filled with her father's meticulous handwriting, documenting systematic crime. "This is what they want," she explained, opening to a page marked with red ribbon. Maps showing exactly which Apache lands were seized, financial records of bribes, correspondence with someone identified only as EC, who organized the false flag operations. Dasan studied the page with growing intensity. "Here," he said suddenly, pointing to a section outlined in red ink. "Dove Springs, my grandfather's winter camp for 6 generations. What made it valuable to mining companies? Silver deposits in the surrounding hills. The land was worthless to white men until they found ways to extract profit. Then suddenly we became hostile for defending our homes. The raids that justified the seizures completely fabricated. White men dressed as Apache warriors attacking supply wagons, while my people attended peace councils 50 miles away. Dasan turned to another page showing financial records. These payments to EC begin 2 years before the first false raid. Someone was being paid to study our customs, learn our fighting techniques, understand our boundaries well enough to impersonate us convincingly. Charlotte felt sick as she comprehended the conspiracy's scope. They spent 2 years preparing to frame your people. Long-term planning for maximum profit. Very methodical. Dasan closed the evidence carefully. And very dangerous to anyone who threatens to expose it. Approaching hoofbeats interrupted their analysis. Through heat shimmer, their pursuers were visible as dark shapes moving with steady determination. We need to move, Dasan decided. Coyote Pass is 10 miles south. Defensive positions there, water escape routes they might not know about. As they remounted, Charlotte studied her unlikely savior. Dasan appeared to be in his late 20s, with the lean build of someone who lived by physical skill. His face bore weathered lines from desert exposure, along with a scar running from his left temple to his jaw, probably from a cavalry saber. He wore a mixture of traditional Apache clothing and army surplus gear, buckskin leggings and moccasins, but also a cavalry shirt and gun belt that spoke of service as a military scout. The combination represented a man caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, but drawing strength from both. "Why help me?" Charlotte asked as they mounted. Dasan was quiet for a moment. "My father led our band for 15 years. Strong man respected in council. The false raids happened while he was negotiating expanded reservation boundaries. When he returned to find our winter camp burned, the shame killed him more surely than any bullet. He died believing his people had broken their word. He died knowing that white men would always find justification for taking what they wanted regardless of Apache honor." Dasan's voice carried old pain, carefully controlled. "But your book of secrets can restore that honor. Prove we kept our promises. Clear our names of crimes we never committed." Charlotte understood the weight of responsibility she carried. This wasn't just about her freedom, it was about the honor of a dead man and the future of his displaced people. They rode hard across broken country that tested both horses and riders. The sun climbed toward its merciless zenith, turning the desert into a furnace. Behind them, their pursuers maintained steady pressure. Without closing the gap, professional tactics suggesting they were herding their quarry toward predetermined interception points, rather than risking horses in direct pursuit. "They're not trying to catch us," Dasan observed during a brief rest. "They're pushing us toward ground of their choosing. Can we avoid their trap? Maybe, if we're willing to risk country that might kill us anyway." Charlotte checked the sun's position. Her modified wedding dress was soaked with sweat and torn in multiple places, but she felt stronger than she had in months. The physical challenge was brutal, but it was also honest in a way her previous life never had been. As they prepared to continue toward Coyote Pass, Charlotte found herself thinking about the mysterious EC. The payments were substantial and regular, suggesting long-term partnership rather than hired labor. More troubling, the timing indicated EC had been instrumental in planning the false flag operations from inception. Whoever organized those fake raids, she said suddenly, they would have needed intimate knowledge of Apache customs to make them believable. Yes, Dasan agreed. Language fighting techniques, territorial boundaries, seasonal movement patterns, years of close observation. A trader who worked with your people, someone from the Indian agency, most possible, or someone with military experience. Cavalry officer or army scout who turned knowledge against the people who trusted him. The implication was chilling. If their primary adversary combined military training with detailed understanding of Apache culture, their chances of escape diminished dramatically. But Charlotte had committed herself to this course. The evidence she carried could restore stolen land and expose conspiracy that had destroyed families and communities. As the sun reached its cruel zenith, Charlotte made peace with the possibility that she might die pursuing justice rather than live accepting injustice. It was a far better choice than the one her father had tried to force upon her. The Rio Salado ran swift and silver between banks of red stone, its waters turned molten by late afternoon sunlight. Charlotte and Dasan had been riding hard for 4 hours, following ancient trails through forests of saguaro cacti and stands of palo verde trees. The river represented both salvation and mortal danger, desperately needed water for their exhausted horses, but also an obvious stopping point where professional hunters might establish killing grounds. Charlotte's throat felt raw with thirst, her modified wedding dress dark with sweat. Dasan dismounted, first rifle ready, as he scanned the opposite bank and boulder fields beyond. The setting sun created long shadows that could conceal armed men, and rushing water would mask enemy approach until they were dangerously close. "Quickly," he whispered. "Water the horses, then we cross immediately." Charlotte slid from her mare's back legs, trembling with exhaustion. As her horse lowered its head to drink, Charlotte knelt beside the stream and cupped cool water in her hands. It tasted of minerals, but was clean and desperately welcome. "Tell me about your family," she said quietly, partly to distract herself and partly to better understand the man who had risked everything to help her. Dasan kept watch while answering. "My father led our band for 15 years. Fought Mexican soldiers when I was young and then made peace with Americans when the territory changed hands. He believed treaties could be honored by both sides if men of goodwill negotiated honestly." "What happened to your mother and sister after the land seizures?" "Relocated to San Carlos Reservation. Government supplies inadequate water, scarce land unsuitable for traditional foods." Dasan's voice carried controlled rage. "My sister died of fever last winter. My mother grows weaker each month." Charlotte felt the weight of personal tragedy behind the clinical description. The false flag operations that had enriched her father had destroyed real families, scattered ancient communities. "The winter camps that were seized," she asked, "were they just seasonal hunting grounds?" "Sacred sites. Places where our ancestors are buried, where traditional ceremonies must be performed. Dove Springs wasn't just my grandfather's camp, it was the heart of our people's connection to this country. Without access to sacred sites, we become spiritually homeless." Before Charlotte could respond, the first gunshot shattered evening quiet. The bullet struck water inches from her position, sending up a geyser that soaked her damaged dress. More shots followed immediately, at least 3 different weapons firing from concealed positions among riverside boulders, muzzle flashes brilliant in gathering dusk. Charlotte's horse screamed and reared as a second bullet creased its neck, blood streaming black in fading light. Additional shots erupted from multiple directions as their pursuers revealed positions established with military precision. "Down!" Dasan tackled Charlotte sideways into the stream as bullets whined overhead. The water was shockingly cold, stealing her breath and immediately soaking through her clothes. Around them, rifle fire erupted from at least 4 different positions. "The evidence." Charlotte gasped, clutching the oilskin pouch as current tried to sweep her downstream. "Hold tight and swim." Dasan returned fire with his cavalry pistol shots, echoing off canyon walls as he tried to suppress the ambush long enough for them to reach the opposite bank. His paint horse had bolted across the river at the first gunshot, but Charlotte's wounded mare stumbled and fell heavily on the gravel bar. The river current was stronger than it appeared, fed by mountain snowmelt and channeled between narrow banks. Charlotte had learned to swim in the stock pond behind her father's house, but this was entirely different cold water pulling at heavy fabric, while bullets sparked off rocks around her head. Dasan stayed beside her, sometimes pushing her ahead when current threatened to sweep her into exposed positions. In the chaos of rushing water and gunfire, Charlotte couldn't determine if he was hitting anything, but his shots forced enemies to take cover. And there she's hit, currents taking them downstream. Get the horses to the ford. Alive, damn you, we need her breathing. That last voice carried the harsh rasp Charlotte had heard during their escape from Whiskey Bend, the gray-haired leader whose bearing suggested military experience. The continued emphasis on capturing rather than killing her confirmed the damning evidence's understood value. They reached the western bank, gasping and shivering clothes streaming water that would make them vulnerable to hypothermia once desert temperature dropped. Charlotte's dress had become a sodden mass that clung to her body and threatened to trip her, while the bullet wound on her arm sent fire through her nervous system with each heartbeat. But they were alive, and the evidence was intact. "Can you ride?" Dasan asked, helping her toward his paint horse. Charlotte examined her wounded arm, finding the bullet had cut a shallow furrow along her forearm, painful and bloody, but not incapacitating. "Yes, but we've lost a horse and most of our supplies, and they know exactly where we are." Dasan helped her mount behind him. River crossing was anticipated. They positioned for it. The tactical implications were sobering. Their pursuers weren't simply following tracks, they were predicting destinations and establishing ambushes with professional competence that spoke of careful planning and intimate terrain knowledge. Behind them, sounds of pursuit resumed, as enemies organized to cross the river and continue the chase. But the water crossing had cost valuable time, evening the tactical situation slightly. "Where now?" Charlotte asked. "That's north to the old mine workings," Dasan decided. "Abandoned tunnels, multiple entrances, difficult for mounted pursuit. We can lose them in underground maze and emerge miles from where they expect us." "Is it safe?" Dasan's harsh laugh carried no humor. "Nothing is safe now, but dangerous for us might also be dangerous for them." They climbed into foothills where ancient mining operations had honeycombed the mountainside with shafts and tunnels. The abandoned workings represented calculated gamble refuge that could become trap concealment, that could become tomb. The abandoned old mesa mine yawned before them. Like the maw of some prehistoric beast, its timber-framed entrance black against silver moonlight. Charlotte shivered against Dasan's back as their horse picked its way carefully up the rocky slope, her wet dress offering no protection against mountain air that carried winter's bite. Inside the tunnel, darkness was absolute. Timber supports creaked ominously, and Charlotte could hear distant water dripping somewhere in the underground maze. The air smelled of old dynamite and the peculiar metallic scent that came from silver ore extracted decades earlier. "How far back do these tunnels extend?" Charlotte whispered. "The miles may be deeper than anyone knows." Dasan dismounted and helped her down. Mexican miners followed ore veins wherever they led. Some passages connect to other mines, some to natural cave systems. Perfect place to lose pursuit if we don't lose ourselves first. They led the horse deeper into the mountain, following the main tunnel by touch, since they dared not risk light that might be visible from outside. The footing was treacherous, loose rock, abandoned equipment, and puddles of water. More than once, Charlotte stumbled, saved from serious falls only by Dasan's quick reflexes. "Listen," he said, suddenly freezing in place. Charlotte strained her ears and heard what had caught his attention. Voices echoing from the mine entrance, distorted by tunnel acoustics, but clearly human and clearly hostile. 3 men, maybe 4, Dasan assessed quietly. Moving carefully. They understand tunnel fighting is dangerous work. The voices grew clearer as searchers moved deeper. "Split up at the first junction. Cover all passages systematically." "What about cave-ins? These old workings aren't stable." "Cave-ins will solve our problem if they're caught in them. Just find the girl and the evidence she's carrying." That last voice belonged to the gray-haired leader, the man whose raspy tone suggested old throat damage and whose tactical competence implied extensive military training. Charlotte found something hauntingly familiar about the voice, though she couldn't place it. "Move," Dasan breathed, leading their horse toward a side passage. "Stay together, stay quiet, stay alive." They descended through passages that grew progressively narrower and more unstable, guided only by Dasan's phenomenal sense of direction and faint air currents. The darkness was so complete that Charlotte couldn't see her own hand inches from her face. Behind them, sounds of pursuit continued, boots scraping on stone, voices calling back and forth between search teams. But tunnel acoustics made distance judgment impossible. "Water," Dasan announced softly, stopping beside what sounded like a small underground stream. Charlotte knelt beside the flow and discovered it was barely more than a trickle. But it was clean and cold and desperately welcome. She cupped the precious liquid carefully and drank slowly. "The evidence," she said, suddenly remembering to check the oilskin pouch. "Is it damaged from the river crossing?" Dasan examined the pouch by touch. "Seems secure, but we should verify contents when we can risk light. And if pages are damaged, then we memorize what we can and hope memory survives longer than we do." The prospect of losing carefully documented evidence was almost more frightening than immediate danger of armed pursuit. Charlotte had risked everything to preserve proof of conspiracy that had destroyed Apache communities and made her father wealthy. A new sound from deeper tunnels caught their attention, the groaning protest of overstressed timber supports somewhere in the mine's depths. The mountain itself was reminding them that these workings were decades old, inadequately maintained, and potentially deadly. Passage splits ahead. Dasan observed testing air currents. Left goes down toward deeper workings, right angles up toward possible surface connections. Which is safer? Neither is safe, but up might get us out faster. They chose the ascending passage, though it required leaving their horse behind in a small chamber where water seepage created a tiny pool. The climbing tunnel was nightmare terrain of loose rock-rotting timber and gaps where floor had collapsed into lower workings. Charlotte's modified wedding dress began disintegrating completely as she scraped against rough stone surfaces and crawled through openings barely large enough for human bodies. Worse, the bullet wound on her arm had reopened, and she could feel warm blood soaking through the makeshift bandage. "Rest here," Dasan decided, finding a slightly wider section. "Check wounds, verify evidence, plan next moves." Using extreme caution to shield the flame, Dasan lit a match and held it briefly while Charlotte examined her precious book. Several pages showed water damage from their river crossing, and ink had run slightly on some entries, but crucial information remained legible. "Look at this entry," Charlotte said, pointing to a page she hadn't examined carefully before. "These payments to EC don't just cover the period of false raids. They extend back 5 years and continue right up to last month." Dasan studied the dates and amounts by flickering matchlight. "Long-term partnership, not hired labor for specific operations. Which means EC is still active, still working with my father, still profiting from land seizures." Charlotte felt sick as implications became clear. The conspiracy didn't end with Apache removals. It's ongoing and expanding. The match burned down to Dasan's fingers, plunging them back into absolute darkness. But the brief illumination had revealed something even more disturbing, fresh boot prints in soft earth of the tunnel floor. "Someone else has been through here recently," Dasan observed grimly. "Today, maybe yesterday. Our pursuers, different boots, different gait pattern. Someone who knows these tunnels intimately." Dasan's voice carried growing concern. "Someone who might be waiting for us." The possibility of enemies both behind and ahead transformed their tactical situation from difficult to nearly hopeless. But retreat was equally impossible. Sounds of pursuit from below had grown closer. "Forward," Dasan decided grimly. Better to fight in open air than die in darkness. They climbed toward what they hoped was exit, guided by air currents that suggested surface connections. Behind them, their pursuers grew ever closer, voices echoing through tunnels until the very mountains seemed to whisper threats. Charlotte pressed her hand against the evidence pouch and drew strength from its weight. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, truth would survive. The tunnel exit emerged onto a narrow ledge halfway up the mountainside, offering panoramic view of the desert basin they had crossed during their desperate flight. Dawn was breaking over eastern mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed mockingly beautiful given their dire circumstances. There, Dasan pointed toward a cluster of riders moving across the valley floor, perhaps 2 miles distant. 4 men spreading out to cover multiple escape routes, their positioning for coordinated interception. Charlotte shielded her eyes against growing light. Even at this range, she could see the methodical way they established positions, their movements coordinated with military precision. They knew where this tunnel exits. She realized with growing dread. They've been herding us toward this exact location. Elaborate trap, Dasan confirmed grimly. Very patient, very thorough. Someone planned this operation with intimate knowledge of both terrain and Apache tactical thinking. The implications were chilling. Their enemies hadn't simply followed tracks, they had anticipated movements, predicted destinations, and established killing grounds with confidence that came from understanding both landscape and their quarry's likely responses. Before Charlotte could respond, voices from the tunnel behind them announced that their immediate pursuers were closing distance rapidly. Move, Dasan decided. Down the mountain, stay in cover, try to reach positions where we can turn their tactics against them. They began dangerous descent down the mountainside, using every bit of cover provided by boulders, stunted trees, and erosion channels. The terrain was treacherous in daylight, made worse by loose rock and Charlotte's growing exhaustion. Her wounded arm throbbed with each movement, and her modified wedding dress had been reduced to little more than rags. But she had never felt more alive, more focused, or more certain of her purpose. Behind them, shouts from tunnel exit announced that their pursuers had reached surface and were beginning their own descent. The hunt was resuming with deadly earnestness. They reached the valley floor as sun climbed above eastern peaks. The desert morning was alive with sound coyotes calling from distant ridges, wind rustling through sage, the distant cry of a hawk. But most ominously, the drum of hoofbeats approaching from multiple directions. Here they come, Dasan observed, leading Charlotte toward a dry wash that offered the only meaningful cover. 4 riders from south, 3 more from east. Charlotte could see them now, professional manhunters spreading out to surround their position with confidence of men who had done this work many times before. Their horses were fresh weapons ready. The leader was the gray-haired man she had seen during their escape from Whiskey Bend, his bearing unmistakably authoritative as he directed subordinates into position. Something about his posture nagged at Charlotte's memory. Charlotte, the leader, called across intervening distance, his raspy voice carrying clearly. This has gone far enough. Surrender the evidence, and we'll discuss terms. What terms? She called back. Safe passage to Mexico for you and your Apache friend. All we want is that book your father was careless enough to leave unsecured. The offer was probably deception, but it revealed important information about their enemy's priorities. They wanted evidence intact and understood its value well enough to negotiate. Now who are you? Charlotte shouted. Why is this evidence worth so much trouble? The leader's harsh laugh carried genuine amusement. Ask your father about old partnerships and family obligations. Ask him about the true price of success in territorial politics. Before Charlotte could process the cryptic response, the attack began in earnest. Rifle fire erupted from multiple directions as manhunters closed their trap bullets, whining off rocks as Charlotte and Dasan dove deeper into the wash. Stay down. Dasan returned fire with his carbine shots echoing off canyon walls. Count muzzle flashes. How many weapons? 6, maybe 7. Charlotte pressed herself against sandy bottom of the wash evidence pouch, clutched against her chest as bullets sparked off stones inches from her head. They're completely surrounding us. The firefight was brief, but intense, with enemies demonstrating professional fire discipline that made escape seem impossible. But Dasan understood how to make terrain work for them, despite being outnumbered. "Flash flood channel," he explained rapidly while reloading. "Branches upstream rejoins downstream. If we can reach the fork, we can split their pursuit." They began working their way upstream along the wash bottom, using what little cover was available, while bullets continued to bracket their position. Charlotte had never been under hostile fire before, and the experience was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, every nerve ending alive with desperate awareness. The wash branched, as Dasan had predicted, creating two channels that diverged for perhaps half a mile before rejoining near cottonwood trees. The separation would force pursuers to split forces or risk losing their quarry entirely. "You take left fork," Dasan instructed. "I'll take right and draw their attention." Then Charlotte grabbed his arm with desperate strength. "We stay together. The evidence is what matters. If one of us dies, the other must get the book to territorial authorities." Before Charlotte could argue further, the decision was made for them by arrival of reinforcements, and the 3 men who had been pursuing them through mine tunnels had reached valley floor and were moving to cut off both escape routes. "Together, then," Dasan decided grimly. "Left fork, move fast." They ran along sandy bottom of the wash as bullets whined overhead. Charlotte's dress finally disintegrated completely during the desperate flight, leaving her in just chemise and petticoats, but freedom of movement was worth any loss of modesty. Behind them, she could hear pursuers organizing. 2 in each wash. Don't let them reach those trees. What about the girl? Still want her breathing. Breathing, if possible, but not if it means losing the evidence. That book is worth more than any individual life. The cold calculation in the leader's voice made Charlotte's blood run cold. These men were prepared to kill her, if necessary, to recover evidence that could expose the conspiracy. They reached the cottonwood grove, with bullets still singing around their ears, diving into blessed shade and cover. But their enemies were close behind, and sound of approaching hoofbeats announced that mounted pursuit was converging. "End of the line," Dasan observed, checking his remaining ammunition. "Good place to make final stand, at least. Water cover, clear fields of fire." Charlotte clutched the evidence pouch and tried to prepare herself for what might be her final moments. They had come so far, sacrificed so much, fought so hard to preserve proof that could restore justice and expose truth. Charlotte stumbled through the narrow passage, her torn chemise catching on rough stone as she followed the faint air current deeper into the mine's heart. She and Dasan had been separated during a sudden cave-in that sealed the tunnel they'd been navigating, and now she was alone in absolute darkness, following instinct and desperation toward what she hoped might be another exit. The passage opened suddenly into a chamber lit by oil lamps, the first artificial light she'd seen since entering the underground maze. Charlotte froze in the entrance, her heart hammering, as she took in what lay before her. The chamber had been converted into a makeshift office with maps spread across a rough wooden table, filing cabinets against one wall, and personal belongings that spoke of regular occupation. But it wasn't the evidence of recent habitation that made her blood turn to ice. It was the specific items scattered around the room that could belong to only one person in the world. On the desk, weighted down by a piece of silver ore, lay a small wooden horse with a broken leg, a toy she remembered from childhood, carved by her uncle Ephraim before he left for cavalry service. Beside it sat a daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame, her father, her mother, herself as a young child, and Uncle Ephraim in his army uniform, all posed formally in front of the mayor's house. Charlotte's hands trembled as she examined other personal effects. Cavalry officers' brass buttons, a leather journal filled with handwriting she recognized despite the years that had passed. Maps of Apache territories marked with detailed tactical notations in familiar script. And most damning of all, a stack of correspondence tied with red ribbon letters signed EC. In the same handwriting that filled the journal, the same handwriting she remembered from childhood birthday cards. Ephraim Crowley, her father's younger brother, supposedly killed in action during an Apache raid in 1877. His body never recovered, his death mourned by the entire family and commemorated with a marble headstone in Whiskey Bend Cemetery. But Uncle Ephraim wasn't dead. He was very much alive, operating under the assumed name of Daniel Briggs, and he was the mysterious E.C., whose initials appeared throughout her father's record book as the architect of the false flag operations. Charlotte sank into the chair behind the desk, her legs unable to support her weight, as the full scope of betrayal became clear. The uncle who had taught her to ride, who had told her bedtime stories about brave cavalry officers, who had held her when she cried after her mother died, that same man had orchestrated systematic genocide for profit, and let her father believe he was dead for 4 years. She opened the leather journal with shaking hands, finding page after page of detailed planning for the false Apache raids. Tactical assessments of tribal movements, analyses of territorial politics, calculations of mineral wealth in seized lands. Everything documented in Uncle Ephraim's meticulous handwriting. The Dove Springs operation successful. Read 1 entry dated 3 years ago. Apache families relocated per schedule. Mineral rights secured through territorial office. Estimated profit $200,000 initial. Another entry more recent. Charlotte asking questions about territorial land sales. Silas concerned but believes situation manageable through marriage arrangement. Monitor closely, teenage girls can be dangerously idealistic. The clinical tone made Charlotte feel physically ill. Her uncle had been watching her, evaluating her as a potential threat, discussing her future marriage as if she were livestock. But the most devastating entry was dated just 1 week ago. Silas reports book missing from private safe. Charlotte's bedroom searched, no evidence found. If she discovered and removed documentation, situation requires immediate resolution before evidence reaches federal authorities. Bloodline considerations secondary to operational security. Bloodline considerations secondary to operational security. Her own uncle was prepared to kill her to protect the conspiracy that had made them wealthy through systematic fraud and cultural destruction. Well, my little niece still poking around in affairs that don't concern her. Charlotte spun around to find Ephraim Crowley standing in the chamber entrance, his weathered face bearing the same pale blue eyes and stubborn jaw that marked him unmistakably as family despite the years and assumed identity. He was older, scarred by desert sun and wind, but still recognizably the cavalry officer who had been her childhood hero, Uncle Ephraim. Her voice broke with shock and betrayal. You're supposed to be dead. Father mourned you. We all mourned you. Ephraim Crowley died in Apache country exactly as Army records state. He replied, stepping into the chamber and closing the heavy door behind him with a sound like a coffin lid. But Daniel Briggs was born from his ashes, a mining engineer and territorial businessman, with no inconvenient military obligations or family connections. The chamber suddenly felt smaller, the air thinner. Charlotte was trapped underground, with a man who had abandoned every principle of honor and decency for material gain. The Apache raids, the stolen land, all of it, you organized everything. I provided expertise and leadership, while your father handled political aspects and legal frameworks. Ephraim moved closer, his boots echoing on stone floor. Together, we built an empire that has made our family wealthy beyond most people's dreams. Built on lies and murder and stolen sacred sites. We're built on recognized opportunities and efficient resource utilization. Ephraim's voice carried the same gentle tone he had used when she was small and afraid of thunderstorms, but now it chilled her to the bone. The Apache way of life was ending regardless, Charlotte. We simply ensured its conclusion served useful purposes rather than meaningless sentiment. Charlotte clutched the evidence pouch against her chest, understanding that she was trapped with a man who viewed human life as a business expense. You let Father believe you were dead for 4 years. You let me grieve for you. How could you do that to people who loved you? because love is a luxury we cannot afford on the frontier. Ephraim sat on the edge of the desk, his posture casual, but his eyes never leaving her face. Dead men have no official obligations, no army superiors to report to, no inconvenient questions. Ephraim Crowley was bound by military regulations and family expectations. Daniel Briggs can pursue any profitable opportunity without interference. The chamber felt like a tomb now. Charlotte looked around desperately, calculating distances to possible escape routes while trying to keep her uncle talking. But the door was the only exit she could see, and he was positioned to block it, including murdering your own niece. The silence stretched between them like a physical weight. When Ephraim finally spoke, his voice carried genuine sadness that made the threat even more terrifying, including that if you force me to choose between family sentiment and family survival. Charlotte edged toward what looked like another passage half hidden behind filing cabinets. "The toy horse," she said, pointing to the carved wooden animal. "You made that for me when I was 7 years old. You promised to fix it when you came back from your next patrol, I remember." Ephraim's voice carried unexpected emotion. "You cried when I left for what turned out to be my final mission. Said you had a feeling something bad would happen. I was right, wasn't I? Something bad did happen. My uncle died and was replaced by someone who could orchestrate genocide for money. Your uncle evolved into someone who could provide security and prosperity for his family in a dangerous world." Ephraim's temper flared briefly before he controlled it. "Everything I've done has been for you, Charlotte, for Silas, for the family name, for the future we're building." For yourself," Charlotte corrected, continuing to edge toward the hidden passage. "For your own greed and power. Don't pretend this was about protecting anyone but Daniel Briggs and his mining profits." The accusation hit home. She could see it in his eyes. For just a moment, the mask of justified necessity slipped and revealed the self-serving calculations that had motivated every decision since he faked his death. "Give me that book, Charlotte." Ephraim's voice was quiet now, but carried absolute finality. "Give me the evidence, and I'll arrange safe passage to California. You can start a new life far from territorial politics. And let you continue destroying Apache families for mining rights. Oh, listen to yourself." Ephraim stood up his hand, falling casually to the revolver on his belt. "You're talking about human beings as obstacles to be cleared, rather than recognizing fundamental economic realities. The philosophical gulf between them was unbridgeable. Her uncle had dehumanized an entire people to justify their destruction, while she had learned that some prices were too high to pay regardless of potential benefits." Charlotte darted toward the passage entrance, but Ephraim was already moving to block her escape. But as she ran, a familiar voice echoed from the hidden passage, Dasan, somehow having found another route through the maze of tunnels, his rifle ready, and his dark eyes filled with cold rage as he took in the scene before him. "Step away from her," he said quietly, his weapon trained on the man who had destroyed his family's honor and driven his people from sacred lands. "Step away or join your ancestors in whatever hell welcomes murderers and thieves." The midpoint twist had revealed not just her uncle's survival and role in the conspiracy, but the true scope of corruption that had consumed her family. Charlotte was no longer just fighting for justice. She was fighting to decide what kind of person she would become when family loyalty collided with moral principle. The underground chamber erupted into violence as Ephraim drew his revolver with the smooth motion of a man who had killed many times before. But Dasan was already moving, diving sideways as the bullets sparked off stone where his head had been moments earlier. The sound of gunfire in the confined space was deafening, and Charlotte's ears rang as she scrambled for cover behind the desk. "Run!" Dasan shouted, working the lever of his carbine as he rolled behind a filing cabinet. "Find another way out." But Charlotte could see that the hidden passage Dasan had emerged from was now blocked by fallen stone. The gunshot had triggered a small cave-in that sealed their only alternate escape route. They were trapped in the chamber with a man who had nothing left to lose. Touching reunion. Ephraim snarled, reloading his revolver with practiced efficiency. The noble Apache warrior and the idealistic white girl fighting for justice in a world that rewards only survivors. But you've made a fundamental error in tactics. You've cornered a desperate man in his own stronghold. The chamber that had seemed spacious moments before now felt like a trap. The stone walls offered solid cover, but they also limited movement and created deadly ricochets from missed shots. Worse, Charlotte realized that Ephraim knew every inch of this underground fortress he had created. Why? Charlotte called out from behind the desk, trying to keep her uncle talking while Dasan worked his way around the chamber's perimeter. Why fake your death? Why betray everything you once stood for? I stood for nothing but army pay and political platitudes. Ephraim's voice carried bitter amusement. Do you think I enjoyed taking orders from incompetent officers, following regulations written by men who had never seen combat? Ephraim Crowley was a fool who believed in honor and duty. Daniel Briggs understands that power and wealth are the only currencies that matter. Dasan appeared suddenly from behind another filing cabinet, his rifle barrel seeking a clear shot. But Ephraim was already moving, using his intimate knowledge of the chamber's layout to stay one step ahead. Your people's land was worth millions. Ephraim continued, his voice echoing strangely off stone walls. Sacred sites sitting on silver deposits, ceremonial grounds covering mineral veins. All that wealth wasted on primitive superstitions while white families struggled to survive. Those families survived by stealing from people who couldn't fight back. Charlotte shot back. Those families survived by recognizing opportunities and taking calculated risks. Ephraim's revolver cracked again, the bullet splintering wood inches from Charlotte's position. Your Apache friend understands survival. Ask him how his ancestors took land from weaker tribes. But Dasan's response was action rather than words. Using a technique learned from years of hunting, he created a distraction by kicking over an oil lamp, plunging half the chamber into dancing shadows while he moved to a new position. The chamber became a maze of flickering light and moving shadows, with three people playing a deadly game of hunter and hunted among the evidence of systematic corruption. Charlotte could hear her uncle moving his boots scraping on stone, but the acoustic properties made it impossible to pinpoint his exact location. Charlotte. Ephraim's voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. You were always my favorite niece, the brightest, the most spirited, the most like your mother. Don't throw your life away for people who would have lost their land, regardless. I'm not throwing my life away, Charlotte replied, edging toward what she hoped was better cover. I'm choosing what to do with it. You're choosing to die for abstract principles instead of living for concrete benefits. Ephraim's frustration was audible now. The Apache territories were going to be seized whether we profited or not. We simply ensured that our families shared in the prosperity. The rationalization was elegant in its simplicity and horrifying in its implications. Ephraim had convinced himself that participating in systematic evil was not only acceptable, but necessary. A sudden crash echoed through the chamber as Dasan overturned another filing cabinet, using it as mobile cover while he advanced on Ephraim's position. Papers scattered across the stone floor, more evidence of the conspiracy that had destroyed Apache communities. Enough! Ephraim roared, abandoning stealth for direct assault. He emerged from cover with both revolver and a backup pistol, firing rapidly at both targets while moving toward the chamber's only exit. Charlotte dove sideways as bullets whined past her head, landing hard on the stone floor amid scattered documents. The impact drove the breath from her lungs, but she forced herself to keep moving, crawling toward better cover while clutching the evidence pouch against her chest. Dasan's rifle answered Ephraim's pistols, the heavier caliber bullets chipping stone and sending up clouds of dust. But Charlotte could see that her Apache ally was wounded, a dark stain spreading across his left shoulder where one of Ephraim's shots had found its mark. "The passage," Dasan shouted, gesturing toward a narrow opening Charlotte hadn't noticed before. "Behind the maps, get out of here." But Charlotte could see that Ephraim was already moving to block that escape route. If she fled now, Dasan would be left alone to face a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to kill family members. "I'm not leaving you," she called back, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. Instead of retreating, Charlotte did something that caught both men completely off guard. She grabbed one of the overturned oil lamps and hurled it at a stack of papers near where Ephraim was positioned. The glass shattered against stone, spreading burning oil across documents and maps that represented years of careful planning. "No!" Ephraim screamed, abandoning his tactical position to try to save evidence of his criminal enterprise. "Those records are irreplaceable." The momentary distraction was all Dasan needed. His rifle cracked once more, the bullet taking Ephraim in the leg and dropping him to one knee among the burning papers. But the fire was spreading rapidly, and smoke was beginning to fill the chamber with toxic fumes. "Move," Dasan commanded, hauling Charlotte toward the narrow passage. "Fire will bring down the whole section." They squeezed through the opening just as Charlotte heard her uncle's voice behind them, no longer threatening, but filled with desperate pleading. "Charlotte, don't leave me here. Don't let me die like this. Please." For just a moment she hesitated. Despite everything he had done, Ephraim Crowley was still her uncle, the man who had carved wooden toys and told bedtime stories. But then she remembered Dasan's sister dead of fever on a reservation. She remembered the Apache families driven from sacred burial grounds. She remembered the systematic evil that had been disguised as territorial development. "You made your choice, Uncle," she called back through the smoke. "Now live with it." They crawled through passages barely large enough for their bodies, while behind them, the fire spread through Ephraim's underground stronghold, consuming evidence, and perhaps consuming the man who had created it. The smoke was thick and choking, but Charlotte could see light ahead. Not the flickering glow of oil lamps, but the clean radiance of desert sunlight. The mesa top stretched before them like a natural amphitheater, its flat stone surface surrounded by sheer drops on three sides, and the smoking ruins of the mine complex behind them. Charlotte and Dasan had emerged from the underground maze to find themselves trapped on a geological island 50 feet above the desert floor, with no visible way down except the burning tunnels they had just escaped. But they were not alone. Sheriff Hal Dodd stood near the mesa's edge with 2 deputies, their rifles trained on the tunnel exit. Behind them, the gray-haired leader of their pursuit, the man Charlotte now knew was her supposedly dead uncle, emerged from a different shaft, his left leg bleeding from Dasan's bullet, but his revolver steady and ready. Touching display of family loyalty back there. Ephraim said, his voice carrying across the mesa with bitter amusement. "Though I'm disappointed you chose to burn years of carefully maintained records rather than preserve them for historical significance. Those records documented genocide," Charlotte replied, backing toward the mesa's center while keeping the evidence pouch pressed against her chest. "They deserve to burn. They documented efficient resource allocation and territorial development." Ephraim was limping as he moved to cut off possible escape routes, but his weapon remained steady. "But no matter. The essential evidence is right there in your hands." Sheriff Dodd stepped forward, his badge gleaming in the morning sunlight. "Miss Crowley, you've caused considerable trouble for important people. Time to hand over that book and put an end to this foolishness." Foolishness. Charlotte looked around the mesa top, calculating distances and options while trying to buy time. "Is that what you call exposing systematic fraud and murder?" "I call it interfering with territorial business that don't concern runaway brides," Dodd replied coldly. But Charlotte had noticed something in the sheriff's tone, uncertainty, perhaps even doubt. She decided to test that weakness with the truth. "Sheriff Dodd." She called out formally, her voice carrying the authority she had learned from years of watching her father manage political crises. "I hereby present evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States government, systematic violation of federal treaties, and murder of federal citizens under color of territorial law." Dodd shifted uncomfortably. "That's a mighty serious accusation, miss, backed by documentary evidence in this book." Charlotte continued holding up the oilskin pouch. "Evidence that shows exactly how much money you received for looking the other way, while Apache families were driven from their homes based on false flag operations." "False flag operations?" One of the deputies asked, confusion clear in his voice. "Shut up, Morrison," Dodd snapped. "Don't listen to her lies." But Charlotte pressed her advantage, speaking directly to the uncertain deputy. "Deputy Morrison, how many Apache raids did you personally investigate? How many tracks did you follow that actually led to Apache camps rather than convenient staging areas?" Morrison's face was troubled now. "Well, there was that business at Willow Creek where the tracks just seemed to disappear." I said shut up. Dodd's rifle swung toward his own deputy, revealing the depth of corruption that had infected territorial law enforcement. The moment of division was all Dasan needed. Despite his wounded shoulder, he launched himself at the nearest deputy, while Charlotte dove for cover behind the only substantial rock formation on the mesa top. Gunfire erupted as the carefully coordinated pursuit dissolved into chaotic violence. But Charlotte wasn't interested in fighting. She was interested in the truth being preserved. While bullets whined overhead, she opened her precious book to a page she had memorized and began reading aloud in a voice that carried across the entire mesa. "Entry dated March 15th, 1878, she called out. "Payment to D. Briggs, $5,000 for coordination of Apache incident at Dove Springs. Casualties 0 Apache, 3 staged wounded among mining crew, substantial property damage for insurance claims. Mineral rights secured through emergency territorial proclamation." "Stop her!" Ephraim roared, trying to advance on Charlotte's position, while Dasan and the deputies fought hand-to-hand among the rocks. Entry dated June 3rd, 1878. Charlotte continued relentlessly. Additional payment to D. Briggs for consultation on Apache fighting techniques and ceremonial practices. Note, subject demonstrates exceptional knowledge of tribal customs and sacred site locations, suggesting extended previous contact with target population. The implications were clear, even to Sheriff Dodd. Their mysterious Daniel Briggs wasn't just a mining consultant, but someone with intimate knowledge of Apache culture who had turned that knowledge against the people who had trusted him. "You're Daniel Briggs, aren't you?" Dodd asked Ephraim with growing understanding. "You're the one who's been organizing these operations from the beginning. I'm the one who's been ensuring territorial prosperity instead of allowing sentiment to interfere with necessary development." Ephraim replied, his revolver now trained on the sheriff, who was beginning to understand the scope of the conspiracy he had unknowingly served. But Charlotte wasn't finished. Entry dated October 12th, 1879. She continued reading. "EC reports successful recruitment of territorial law enforcement. Sheriff Dodd cooperative, but requires substantial financial incentives. Suggest regular payments disguised as federal stipends for Indian Affairs consultation." Dodd's face went white as he realized his own complicity had been documented, and his corruption was now public knowledge. The federal authorities who investigated this matter would find his name throughout the book, connected to systematic fraud that carried penalties up to and including execution for treason. And that's enough. Ephraim limped toward Charlotte's position, his weapon ready to end the threat she represented. "Dodd Morrison, whoever survives this mesa, that girl cannot leave here alive. She knows too much." But Charlotte had one more card to play. Final entry dated May 1st, 1881. She called out. EC identity confirmed as Ephraim Crowley, supposedly deceased brother of Territorial Mayor Silas Crowley. Death falsified through military medical conspiracy. Current operations expanding to include Mexican settlements and homesteader removals for railroad development. The revelation that Daniel Briggs was actually a supposedly dead Army officer who had faked his demise to escape military justice was the final piece of evidence that shattered any remaining loyalty among Ephraim's allies. Deputy Morrison immediately stepped away from the fight, his hands raised to show he was no longer participating. "I didn't sign up for treason," Morrison declared. "Territorial disputes are one thing, but conspiracy against the federal government is a hanging offense." Sheriff Dodd was wavering now, his rifle no longer trained on Charlotte, but not quite aimed at Ephraim either. He was a corrupt man, but not necessarily a treasonous one. "Last chance, Charlotte." Ephraim said quietly, his revolver now the only weapon definitively aimed at her position. "Give me that book, and I'll arrange for everyone on this mesa to walk away alive. Continue this stubborn resistance, and I'll kill you all." Charlotte looked around the mesa one final time at Dasan wounded, but still fighting. At Deputy Morrison struggling with conscience. At Sheriff Dodd calculating odds and loyalties. At her uncle prepared to murder his own family for profit. "No," she said simply. "Justice is worth more than survival." Ephraim's face twisted with rage and desperate sadness. "Then you've chosen death over family principle, over practicality. I hope you're satisfied with your noble gesture when it accomplishes nothing but getting good people killed." He raised his revolver for the final shot that would end Charlotte's threat to his conspiracy forever. But as his finger tightened on the trigger, Dawson appeared behind him with a captured deputy's rifle, the barrel pressed against Ephraim's skull. "Drop your weapon," Dasan commanded quietly. "Drop it or join your victims in whatever place waits for murderers and thieves." For a long moment, the mesa top was frozen in tableau. The Apache scout with his rifle pressed against the fake mining consultant who had destroyed his people. The corrupt sheriff calculating whether loyalty or survival offered better odds. The uncertain deputy watching his entire worldview crumble, and Charlotte holding evidence that could topple a criminal empire. Then Ephraim smiled sadly and pulled the trigger. But the bullet wasn't aimed at Charlotte. Instead, he had turned the weapon on himself, choosing death over capture and federal prosecution. The gunshot echoed across the mesa like thunder, and Ephraim Crowley collapsed onto the stone surface where he had made his final stand. "Uncle Ephraim." Charlotte whispered, rushing to his side despite everything he had done. "I'm sorry, little girl." He gasped, blood frothing on his lips. "I'm sorry for all of it. But I was too far down the wrong path to find my way back to the right one." He died looking at the desert sky he had once loved as a young cavalry officer, before greed and fear had corrupted his sense of honor into systematic evil disguised as territorial development. The cavalry patrol from Fort Verde arrived at the mesa as the sun reached its zenith, their blue uniforms dark with sweat from a hard ride across the desert. Sergeant Michael Owens, a Buffalo soldier whose weathered face spoke of years maintaining peace in hostile territory, surveyed the aftermath with professional assessment. Charlotte sat in whatever shade she could find, her torn chemise covered by Dasan's shirt, the precious evidence secured in federal hands at last. The Apache scout remained conscious, despite his wounds, his shoulder properly bandaged by the patrol's medic. Sheriff Dodd and Deputy Morrison sat apart from each other, both under armed guard, but for different reasons. Morrison had cooperated fully once the scope of the conspiracy became clear, providing additional evidence about territorial law enforcement corruption. Dodd remained silent, calculating legal strategies that might save his life. "Miss Crowley," Sergeant Owens said, approaching with respectful caution. "Telegraph operator Pike sent word about your situation. Looks like she was right to be concerned." Charlotte looked up at the buffalo soldier, noting intelligence in his dark eyes and genuine concern in his expression. Anna Pike's warning had brought help exactly when it was needed most. The evidence, Charlotte said, simply gesturing toward the book that had cost so many lives to preserve. Everything is documented. Land fraud, false flag operations, bribes to territorial officials, systematic conspiracy to defraud both Apache tribes and the federal government. Owens examined the records carefully, his expression growing more troubled as he reviewed pages of meticulous criminal documentation. "This is comprehensive enough to bring down half the territorial government," he observed. "Your father's going to face federal charges that could mean life imprisonment or execution." "My father made his choices," Charlotte replied quietly, "just as I made mine." The practical implications were sobering, but encouraging. The conspiracy might have deep roots in territorial politics, but federal authorities would be compelled to act when presented with such detailed evidence. "What happens to us now?" Charlotte asked. "If we return to testify, will we be safe from retaliation?" Owens was quiet for a moment, considering political complications. "Court protection is possible but not guaranteed. Your father's allies will try to eliminate witnesses if they feel threatened enough. Then we don't return," Dasan said quietly. "Evidence goes to federal authorities, but we find sanctuary elsewhere until legal proceedings are complete." Charlotte realized he was right. Whiskey Bend had become enemy territory, and even federal prosecution wouldn't immediately eliminate all the corrupt officials who had profited from the Apache land seizures. "Mexico?" she asked. "For now," Owens confirmed, "until we know who can be trusted in territorial courts." 2 hours later, they reached the small settlement of Willow Spring, where a combination telegraph office and trading post served scattered ranches and mining claims. Charlotte composed her message carefully, knowing it would probably be intercepted, but determined to give Anna Pike whatever warning she could. "Evidence secured. Stop Ephraim alive until today. Operating as Briggs. Stop federal charges coming. Stop, protect yourself. Stop Charlotte." The telegraph operator transmitted the message without comment, but Charlotte could see him memorizing the content. Word would reach Whiskey Bend within hours, but by then, she and Dasan would be safely across the border. They rode south toward Mexico, following smugglers' trails that avoided main roads where they might be recognized. The landscape gradually changed from high desert to lower elevations, but Charlotte felt no sense of relief or escape. She was no longer Mayor Crowley's daughter or a respectable woman by territorial standards. Her actions had made her an enemy of her own family, an outlaw by association, and a permanent threat to people who had built fortunes on systematic fraud. There could be no return to her former life. At the border crossing, little more than a wooden marker and a bored Mexican official, Charlotte and Dasan said goodbye to Sergeant Owens and the cavalry patrol. The buffalo soldier had arranged for the records to be photographed using new technology, creating permanent copies that could be distributed to federal authorities without risking the original documents. "This evidence won't be forgotten," Owens promised as they prepared to part company. "Whatever happens in the courts, whatever political complications arise, the truth will be preserved and justice will be served. Even if it takes years, even if it takes years. Your uncle and your father built their conspiracy over decades. It may take just as long to undo all the damage they caused." As they crossed into Mexico, leaving behind the only country Charlotte had ever known, she reflected on the transformation that had begun with her flight from an unwanted wedding. The sheltered mayor's daughter, who had discovered her father's secrets, was gone forever, replaced by someone harder, more experienced, and infinitely more dangerous to those who profited from systematic injustice. But she carried with her the knowledge that truth was more powerful than corruption, that honor was more valuable than wealth, and that some principles were worth any personal sacrifice to preserve. 2 years after the violence at Red Mesa, Charlotte stood in the doorway of a small adobe schoolhouse, in the Mexican border town of Esperanza, watching her students practice their letters on slates that caught the morning sunlight. The children ranged in age from 6 to 16, a mixture of Mexican Apache and Anglo families who had found refuge in this remote community, where practical skills mattered more than social pedigree. She had become Mrs. Lottie Hale through the simple expedient of claiming that identity and living it consistently. The transformation from Charlotte Crowley Mayor's daughter and reluctant bride to Lottie Hale frontier schoolteacher and advocate for justice had required complete reconstruction of her understanding of herself and her place in the world. Teaching had revealed talents Charlotte never knew she possessed. Her sheltered upbringing had actually provided excellent preparation for education. She was literate in both English and Spanish, capable with practical mathematics, and familiar with the broader world through her father's extensive library. More importantly, her experience with injustice had given her empathy for students who faced their own struggles. Dasan had recovered most use of his wounded shoulder, though it reminded him of their desperate flight with stiffness in cold weather. He worked as a translator and cultural advisor for the Mexican government, helping negotiate agreements with Apache bands that crossed the border, seeking refuge from American military pressure. They lived as neighbors and partners rather than husband and wife. Their relationship based on mutual respect and shared experience rather than romantic attachment. Charlotte had discovered that her feelings toward marriage had been fundamentally altered by her father's attempt to force her into unwanted union. Letters from Arizona Territory arrived regularly through unofficial channels carried by traders and sympathetic officials. Anna Pike had not only survived the political upheaval in Whiskey Bend, but had established herself as an independent correspondent, documenting the federal prosecution of territorial land fraud and its effects on local communities. The legal proceedings had unfolded as federal officials predicted, slowly, methodically, with numerous complications. Silas Crowley had been arrested on federal charges, but had died in custody before trial, officially of heart failure, though some observers suspected suicide. Most of his political associates had been indicted, fled the territory, or negotiated plea agreements involving substantial financial restitution. Most importantly, the seized Apache lands were being returned to tribal control through a complex legal process that would require years to complete fully. Federal courts had ruled that the false flag operations constituted fraud against both Apache tribes and the United States government, invalidating subsequent land transfers and creating precedent for similar cases throughout the Western territories. Charlotte was teaching her afternoon arithmetic class when the visitor arrived, a young woman in travel-stained clothing, who dismounted from a dust-covered horse and asked directions to the schoolhouse. Charlotte recognized Anna Pike immediately, though her friend looked older and more weathered than she remembered. "Mrs. Hale," Anna said formally when the school day ended. "I hope you don't mind unexpected visitors bearing news from the old territory." Charlotte embraced her friend warmly, feeling connection to her former life that was both welcome and bittersweet. "Anna, how did you find us?" "Finding you was easy. Your reputation as an educator has spread throughout the territory and beyond. As for why I came," Anna gestured toward her saddlebags, which contained substantial correspondence. "I brought news I thought you should hear personally, and an offer that might interest you." Inside the leather bags were dozens of letters from Apache families whose land had been restored, from territorial attorneys working on related cases, from federal officials implementing new policies for Indian affairs. But most significantly, there were letters from young women throughout the American West who had heard Charlotte's story and found inspiration in her choice to abandon security for principle. "You've become something of a legend," Anna explained as they examined the correspondence by lamplight. "The mayor's daughter who chose justice over family loyalty. Parents are naming daughters after you, and some young women are refusing arranged marriages that don't serve their interests." The information was both flattering and intimidating. Charlotte had never intended to become a symbol. She had simply made choices that allowed her to live with her conscience. But apparently, her example had resonated with people facing similar conflicts. Norm. There's more. Anna continued producing an official document with federal seals. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is offering you a position developing educational policy for Apache reservations. Full federal salary, complete autonomy over curriculum, and teacher selection authority. To train others in cross-cultural education methods. Working from Mexico, working from wherever you choose to base your operations. Washington has finally recognized that successful Indian policy requires educators who understand both cultures and can bridge gaps that previous policies created. Charlotte looked at Dasan, who nodded encouragingly. The offer represented everything they had hoped to achieve through their desperate preservation of evidence, official recognition of Apache educational rights resources, to develop culturally appropriate curricula and authority, to train teachers who could prepare Indian children to navigate both traditional and modern worlds. What about legal proceedings? Are we still at risk from my father's remaining allies? The major conspirators are dead, imprisoned, or fled the territory. Anna replied. There might still be individual threats, but the systematic conspiracy that drove you into exile has been dismantled completely. You could return to Arizona if you wanted to. Charlotte walked to the schoolhouse window and looked out at the desert landscape that had become home. The harsh beauty of the borderlands had taught her lessons about survival and adaptation that her privileged upbringing could never have provided. More importantly, the work she was doing here felt more meaningful than anything she had ever accomplished as Mayor Crowley's dutiful daughter. I think Mrs. Lottie Hale has found her calling here in Esperanza, Charlotte said thoughtfully. But perhaps she could travel occasionally to Arizona territory to train teachers and develop curricula for the federal education program. It was a perfect compromise, maintaining her chosen identity and secure home base, while expanding her influence to serve Apache communities throughout the region. The work would be challenging and occasionally dangerous, but it would ensure that the justice they had fought so hard to achieve would have lasting practical benefits. 3 weeks later, Charlotte stood once again on American soil for the first time since her wedding day flight. But now she returned as Mrs. Lottie Hale, federal education consultant and advocate for cross-cultural understanding. Dasan accompanied her as translator and cultural advisor, their partnership officially recognized and supported by both Mexican and American governments. 6 months into her new role, Charlotte received a letter that provided the final surprise in her long journey from dutiful daughter to independent woman. The envelope bore no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakably familiar. Her father's precise script, though shaken by illness and approaching death. My dear daughter. The letter began. I write this knowing I will not live to see your response, but hoping you will understand that everything I did was meant to secure your future and our family's prosperity. The methods were perhaps questionable, but the goals were worthy of a father's love. I know now that I was wrong about many things, most importantly about your character and capabilities. You have proven yourself stronger and more principled than I ever imagined, and I am proud of the woman you have become, despite my failures as your guide and protector. The enclosed documents represent my final gift to you, authenticated records of all property transactions conducted through our family's political influence, including detailed maps of Apache sacred sites that should be protected from future development. I hope this information will serve your educational work and help complete the justice you began when you chose principle over comfort. The documents were exactly as described, comprehensive records that filled gaps in Charlotte's original evidence and provided crucial information about Apache cultural sites that needed federal protection. But more than their practical value, the letter represented her father's final acknowledgement that she had chosen correctly. Charlotte folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer, where it joined other mementos from her journey. Outside her office window, Apache children played in the courtyard of the new federal school, their laughter carrying across the desert air like promises of a better future. She had never returned to Whiskey Bend, and she never would. The mayor's daughter, who had fled from an unwanted wedding, was gone forever, replaced by Mrs. Lottie Hale, frontier educator and advocate for justice. On her desk, next to the carefully preserved original records, sat a new document, a federal commission authorizing establishment of the Crowley Hale Institute for Cross-Cultural Education, funded by restitution money recovered from her father's conspiracy, and dedicated to ensuring that the injustices of the past would never be repeated. The institute would train teachers, develop curricula, and advocate for educational policies that respected cultural differences, while preparing all children for full participation in American society. It would be her father's legacy, transformed from systematic oppression into systematic justice, and her uncle's military expertise redirected from destruction to construction. As Charlotte prepared her lessons for the next day's classes, she reflected on the strange paths that had led her from a church altar in Whiskey Bend to a federal office in Arizona territory. The journey had cost more than she ever imagined when she first lifted her wedding skirts and ran toward an uncertain future. But it had also revealed truths about justice, courage, and the power of individual choice that would guide her work for the rest of her life. Some things were indeed worth any sacrifice to preserve, and some people were worth believing in despite the differences that separated them. Mrs. Lottie Hale, frontier educator and advocate for justice, had found her calling at last.